So this is embracing multi-party dilemma, resolving incidents across company boundaries. Starting off with some front matter, we're going to talk about what the multi-party dilemma is. Then we're going to talk about how we discovered this dilemma through a series of incident analysis we did in 2021. Then we're going to go into the challenges and key findings of this dilemma, and then finally addressing it. What can we do about this? Sarah,
all right.
Bring us through a definition of the multi-party dilemma.
So I think what Alex has hinted at, y'all are probably getting an idea of what we mean when we say multi-party dilemma just from the questions he asked. We wanted to ground in a bit of a academic definition as well. So the multi-party dilemma is a term that we first heard John Allspaw and Dave Woods use in about 2021. To this dynamic that Alex and I had talked about at our respective companies. So the working definition we're going to use for today, it's a pattern that describes challenges at the organizational boundaries between interdependent parties. And when I say pattern, that's important. There's a great Dave Woods talk from LFI Conf where he talks about patterns, including this pattern and what it means to be a pattern. But for the sake of this, patterns have defining characteristics or common characteristics. So some of the ones that we're going to speak to in the multi-party dilemma. Asymmetry is probably the biggest thing that we're going to talk through here. So information asymmetry was the first thing that we researched. That's one side of the boundary knows more than the other. This is more novel on one side than the other. Impact asymmetry is something that we're increasingly encountering and talking about. That's, hey, the vendor has completely taken us down, but to the vendor, we are just one customer that's down and everyone else is up. So the impact is huge for us, but relatively minor for them, and people respond differently based on the impact statements. There's a few others as well, temporal being one of them. This is most evident, this sort of hits a flashpoint with what we call temporally compact pressurized environments. Very fancy word for our purposes of saying an incident. And there's a higher cost of coordination involved as well as potentially goal misalignment with this pattern. So we wouldn't be talking about this if it didn't have consequences. The consequences here is it's a new form of brittleness, and it introduces new forms of failure into complex adaptive systems. The complex piece is important because this really comes into play when you start bringing complexity into systems and trying to cope with the complexity. So hopefully everybody's at sort of like a hazy definition between the academic-y we've talked about and the questions of what we're talking through now. So let's talk a bit about where does this pattern occur. In software, this is very prevalent with vendor relationships, but it also happens inside your company, and that's something that I think Niall's going to talk a bit more about later, which is dynamics inside organizations. But there are definitely cases with your vendor where you're going, okay, we're outsourcing DNS, or we're handing over the people who are going to maybe admin our database or various things, but that you do that internally as well. This is our network team, this is our storage team. So anytime you're sort of moving things across an organizational boundary, that's when we're talking about this. This pattern, when we first started studying it, we were really looking just at software. We've had the opportunity to talk to other industries, and we've talked through examples where this happens in healthcare, in aviation, in utility companies. So it's gotten to the point where our last conversation with Dave Woods, he was really describing it really as a law-like phenomenon. And so specific to tech, you notice I mentioned complexity and drivers of this compartmentalization. Really what we're talking about is we're taking systems and sort of breaking them into pieces and creating boundaries as a result. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So outsourcing and this moving things across boundaries is really an adaptation in most cases to success. So some of the success that we're talking about is scale. Your company is successful, the system is successful, it needs to scale, you need more people to run it, you need more expertise to run it, and so you start to recruit more people in and you need to break them up into logical boundaries. The other piece where we see where this is an adaptation of success is actually complexity. So the systems have increasing amazing capabilities and things that they can do, but they get more complex in the process, and to handle and break up that complexity, we start to kind of put things in logical buckets or move them across to teams, and therefore these boundaries start to occur. So not bad things, we actually view it as a helpful adaptation. It's just a new thing that we have to learn to live with in the software world that we're in right now. And so what we're really seeing with organizations is this desire to focus on core competencies and then rely on the expertise of others in non-core areas to facilitate that scale and address that complexity. So kind of hypothetically what this looks like. This is a hypothetical company's 15-year journey. And you can see how, okay, they've started and they're moving one thing to a vendor, moving one thing to an internal team. and then it just sort of compounds. It's not always linear, but this example it is. But what we want you to see here is that this is really complex. There's a lot of boundaries that start to develop. This dynamic becomes increasingly evident in your system and increasingly important to handle well. And so as that complexity grows, the cost of coordination grows. That's something we're going to talk about later. And there's continuous change on both sides of the boundary. When we talked with folks in the medical field about this, the analogy that we gave to help people understand the way that software changes so quickly is like, if you're an anesthesiologist, you walk in, and the patient that's in front of you, as you're giving them the drugs for anesthesia, their reaction is constantly changing, and you're not necessarily aware or partially aware of how that's happening. And the drugs that are coming from pharmacy are also changing at the same time. Really, in all of the cases that we studied in other industries, we could not find another industry that had this amazing amount of rate of change in the system. So that's something that's unique to tech and interesting in this dynamic. So this brings me to a quote. This is from Dr. McGuire around controlling cost of coordination. What we're dealing with here, these changes, they're exposing organizations to new forms of failure and transforming the work for engineers. That's really what we want to talk about here, is new forms of failure, transforming the work for engineers. There's a surface level to this when we talk about new forms of failure that's like, okay, my vendor is down, therefore I am down, failure. Okay, that's fair and reasonable and interesting, but perhaps more interesting for us is this deeper level, which is that these new forms of failures aren't just about what happened, it's also the dynamic between parties and how it happened and how they work together, and were there failures or successes there, and how do you handle that and respond to that, and how does this change the work that your engineers need to do and that you need to ask of the engineering teams on the other side of the boundary. Sometimes that creates friction, and we'll talk through that as well, and it creates challenges as well on building common ground. And so this has been a little bit theoretical to start off with, but one of the places that the multi-party dilemma was found and was first studied was at Indeed. And so Alex will explain a little bit more of how they found this at Indeed.
Sarah, you spoke to a lot of the general aspects of the multi-party dilemma, but I want to kind of get into where they concretely showed up and how we discovered them at Indeed. So this is the incident analysis methodology that we've been employing for a subset of our incidents. This is a technique that we were trained on from our friends at Adaptive Capacity Labs. And this may not look very familiar to you in terms of how you're currently doing your retrospectives. And it's pretty thorough, and it's not how we do every single one of our incidents, but we do a case selection across a sampling. We sample our incidents with this very deep incident analysis technique. And I want to particularly highlight step 8, thematic analysis, to touch on how we discovered this dynamic. So in order to really talk about thematic analysis, I have to introduce a little bit about what a theme is. So a theme is, it's not a cause of an incident. If you're familiar with the ITIL framework, you're going to want to gravitate to thinking about it as problems, but they're really not. They're really a risk or opportunity that's identified through an incident analysis. Their themes are features of the organization. They describe the organization, but you discover them in an incident, and they're not unique to that incident, as you can see in the image. And again, I want to reiterate, you want to think about them as causes, but themes are not causes. They're kind of just descriptions of the organization that the incident occurred within. And finally, themes are grounded by the analysis that produced them. So in order to claim that a theme is present in an organization, you have to be able to point to the evidence in the case to make that claim. Themes can recur. They can recur because they're part of the incident. And themes that are identified in multiple incidents, that's a good indication that not only are they a part of the organization, but they're probably going to be a little bit challenging to address. Themes can be risks, opportunities, or a mixture of both. And addressing themes, it could mean eliminating them, embracing them, or even just acknowledging they're there. Another thing that incident analysis, another thing that it gives you is insight generation. Gary Klein points out that insights represent a fundamental shift in how experts see the world. It's that aha spark or eureka moment. And I want to contrast that with how we in software traditionally do incident analysis. So I call this the prevent and fix cycle, and it's really this backward-facing process that it aims to avoid surprise and only prepares for like a narrow set of incidents, things that we've encountered before, but it really is not it doesn't help us prepare for things that were completely unexpected. So here's how that dynamic plays out. In your company, you have a surprise, a big incident, and then there's this flurry of activity to go and fix it. It's a massive spike in your focus on safety. And that increased focus on safety kind of persists in the organization through preventions and working on action items until business priorities and efficiencies kind of erode or make trade-offs that take the attention away from safety. That is until the next encounter with an incident, which reinvigorates that focus. In contrast, the learn and adapt reinforcing loop uses incidents as an opportunity to increase general knowledge and preparedness each encounter with the incident, and in that way, it helps the organization get safer and safer and safer as time goes on. It's a forward-looking process instead of a backward-looking process. The prevent and fix, it's like a treadmill. And what do we know about treadmills? You do a lot of work on a treadmill, but you don't go anywhere. Contrast that with the learn and adapt reinforcing loop. So I discussed the advantage of going deep on a certain case or an incident, but really you have a superpower when you do this across a corpus of cases. So imagine you have this kind of background rate of incidents. They're kind of the sand in the gears of your organization, and you stop, you pick one, and you do a deep incident analysis, kind of using the learning from incidents technique that I described earlier. What you're doing is you're actually not looking at the incident itself, but you're using the incident as a lens or a keyhole to look into the organization and uncover things that were previously unseen. If you repeat this, you uncover more and more of the organization that are not obvious to people. If you do this on a continuous basis, perhaps over years, you open a vast window into the organization, revealing things that were completely unseen before, and then you can start to address things that you didn't realize were there until you did this. So taking us back to 2021, Indeed has a learning from incidents practice that's really underway. We're looking at over a dozen incidents across that year, and we're doing our thematic analysis, and we started to see themes that were recurring. And the theme that recurred far and away above all the other themes was this recognition that we were relying on other companies, other third parties, to be operational and responsible for the most important critical services that we have. And there were challenges when we needed to get them, we needed to work with them on incidents involving those business critical dependencies. So the challenges, the implications, so how would you describe these?
Yeah, so when we started to look at this, I think there was a few initial challenges and key findings that we found. As we've continued to pull cases, in some cases from different companies or even different industries, we've found additional challenges and additional key findings. So one of the things that's exciting to me is that what we would have listed as key findings even 6 months ago is very different, like probably double now is what we have. And we're hoping to have that in the future as well. But a few challenges and key findings, and these will probably sound similar to you if you've encountered this in your organization. The first one, and probably the biggest one that we hear about, is these legal, financial, and privacy barriers. Basically, when we want to get information across the boundary, one of the big sort of recoils that we see in organizations is like, if we interacted differently, can we do that legally? Is there a risk to privacy? Is there a risk to security? There's a really healthy tension here. There are very, very valid things. I don't want to get up here and just say, oh, you should totally throw that out the window. Tell legal not to worry about it. There's very valid concerns that we're still figuring out how to work around. But I do think that some of these can be challenged, and we're increasingly seeing this. So some of the places that we're increasingly seeing it, companies are publishing much more detailed public retrospectives from incidents now. The conversations that we're able to have, I've had recently with vendors about incidents, there's a lot more engineering depth than what I would see a few years ago. So that's something that's very exciting to us, is to see us start to exchange information more freely. So I'm not going to tell you this isn't a challenge. This is a big challenge. It's probably one of the biggest challenges. But I do think there's value in starting to have these conversations. And one of the examples I can give you of that value, I was working with one of our vendors and basically just told them, like, hey, I need to know what's going on in the environment. Can you just let me know as soon as you know? If you don't have perfect information, that's okay. I would rather have imperfect information, but no. And they reached out to me and said, hey, we're having an incident, we're not sure if y'all are impacted or not, this is essentially what the incident looks like. And I sort of filed that away, didn't think anything of it. About 2 hours later, I get paged, get on an incident, and it's a system that interacts with that vendor. And it didn't look exactly like what the vendor told me, but there was just enough similarity for me to go, hypothetically, if the information was imperfect from the vendor, what action would we take if we were actually impacted by their incident? So we took that action, and we got out of impact. And not to be counterfactual, but likely much quicker than we would have if we hadn't known that, even if it was imperfect information. We relayed that back to the vendor. They were able to realize they had a much larger blast radius than they first thought. And the thing for me, when I was talking to them and they were going, oh, we're sorry we didn't have more accurate information. And I was like, I'm just thrilled that you gave us information because it helped us get out of impact faster. So I do think that we're starting to see some movement on these fronts, though this continues to be a really challenging thing for organizations to learn to cope with as we are increasingly relying and interdependent on each other. The next thing that we've seen is these hidden transitive dependencies. Sometimes we call them nested dependencies, but essentially you might say, oh, that vendor, let's say I look on the news and there's a massive outage, but we don't rely on that vendor. But do your vendors rely on that vendor? Do your vendors rely on that vendor? So there's a lot of cases where we've seen where it's like getting the information from your vendor, or understanding your relationship with the vendor. Your system is not just you and your vendor. It's actually all of the other vendors that they rely on as well. So Alex, if we need to talk with a vendor, need to get involved, we need to figure out that maybe there is a hidden dependency that collectively we need to work around. It sounds like we should do it. What about coordination costs?
Yeah, I mean, you point out something that could be really effective, which is involving the vendor in your incident, but it's not without cost. Just the act of bringing additional stakeholders into the incident, especially stakeholders that don't have as much context as the employees in your organization, the coordination costs increase. These are coordinative demands to be prepared to work with these additional parties. And we found that this can pose a significant challenge to working across company boundaries. Another challenge about bringing another party into your incident could be mission misalignment. This could lead to working at cross purposes in an incident. So to illustrate what mission misalignment is, I want to tell a little bit of a story about an incident we had years ago with a database vendor. So we were having an outage where we isolated it to a database cluster, and after doing some unsuccessful diagnosis, we realized we're going to need to involve the vendor in order to resolve this. This was a behavior we had never seen before with the database. So we brought the vendor on, hoping that they can help us resolve it quickly. They were kind of struggling to understand what was happening as well. Time was wearing on. The consequence of the incident were getting worse for us. And we found we were starting to work at cross purposes. Indeed has the mission of helping people get jobs. This database vendor has the mission of producing a database that is reliable, fault tolerant, robust, and they wanted to be able to understand what was going on here in case any of their other customers had it. Well, the way we were working across purposes is that we were just kind of done doing diagnosis. We just wanted to restart the database and see if that fixed things, but that would have destroyed any opportunity to capture additional debugging information that this vendor wanted. And so they were kind of compelling us to wait. But we said, no, we're going to just restart it, and that did fix it, but it did take away that opportunity. But notice in this incident, the dynamic that played out is that the time consequence felt more acutely on our side of the boundary than with the vendor. So it's this temporal misalignment, in addition to the mission misalignment, that made that so challenging to work with that vendor. So what I'm depicting here on the screen is an incident response between two companies, a customer and a vendor. And the two boxes represent the two bureaucracies coming together to join up to work on this incident. What happens during this incident is that this third new transient organization kind of spontaneously forms between the two bureaucracies. And there's something very interesting about this transient organization. It has a different set of decision-making operating models. It acts more like a polycentric governance model, which just basically means that decision-making becomes more distributed, and the people who make the decisions are subject matter experts. They're no longer the bureaucrats. And this helps kind of more successfully address the incident at hand because time pressures and uncertainty are the prevailing things here. So some of the challenges that happen within this transient organization is that participants struggle to maintain common ground. Do they share the same goals? How does information get shared? And who holds that decision-making authority? It's not always so clear.
I'm actually going to borrow Alex's diagram, but use it slightly differently, if you don't mind. So when we talk with people about this, what we notice this pattern of is people often talked about our system and their system, which there's nothing wrong with that, and you even hear me doing it a bit in this talk. But there was a realization that was in some cases missing. I think some people tend to think of them as like totally independent and separate. Most people would recognize that they're interdependent. But at this like technical like bits and bytes are flowing level, all actually the same system. And so the important thing to realize is that to some extent, we are all part of this system, and these systems even really expand beyond the bounds of like what we can hold in our heads. But this gets into even some of the hidden dependencies that we talked about, that like the total system is your stuff plus the vendor stuff plus the vendors they rely on, plus maybe they are doing multi-tenancy, so their customers as well. All of that is in play here when we're talking at this technical level. And so that dynamic makes this bidirectional information flow really important because you're talking and sharing information about one unified system. And so we saw pretty much in every case that it was very helpful to have information, but in particular, there were incidents where we needed to have this bidirectional information flow at a really deep engineering level. And so to do that, we had to build reciprocity and help overcome the information asymmetry. But we saw examples where the result was meaningfully impacted because this type of information sharing could happen. A couple factors that make this type of information sharing particularly important: novel incidents, incidents where the resolution path is not clearly understood, and particularly tightly coupled systems or subsystems. So the moment in the story I like to tell of like when this sort of hit home for me and light bulb really on this entire topic, not just this, but the multi-party dilemma as a whole. We were working with a CDN vendor, and there was a very novel issue. It was impacting us, and they wanted information from us because it was very novel to them, and they were trying to figure out what was going on. There were several customers impacted. I think we were the largest. We clearly wanted information from them because we were in a lot of impact, and we would like to get out of impact quickly, please, for our customers. And we got to a point where we got their engineering. We actually had their SRE team on the bridge with us. They were able to give us this context about the bug that they were hitting. And when our SRE teams could speak together kind of in that dynamic that Alex talked about earlier, we were able to devise config changes that needed to happen on both sides of the boundary. And when we were able to do that, we were able to basically lower the consequences of this bug, get the overall system some headroom. They then went and did that with their other customers. They had some degree of multi-tenancy happening, and it gave the entire system some headroom. So it was like this really interesting, okay, we had to work together. Neither of us could have done that alone. But the really super interesting thing for me about this is that after we did that change and they rolled that change out to other customers, they came back to us and we're back on the bridge with them. We said, we're somewhat out of impact. We'd like to get much more out of impact, and y'all are still trying to figure out the details of this bug. Here's another change that we thought we might put into place to try and alleviate impact. What do y'all think? And it was like color drained from everyone's face on the vendor side, and there was this immediate like, no, please don't do that. And what we didn't know, because we didn't realize how this bug was manifesting on their side of the boundary, was that if we had done that, we would have actually triggered a retry storm, and their belief is that we would have brought the system down significantly beyond how degraded it was at the initial part of the incident. So it was one of those situations where you're going, gosh, if we hadn't had that conversation, this might have really been a bad day for everyone, even more so than it was. So for me, that was sort of that moment that was like, this is important. We have to talk about this because as our systems get more complex, that dynamic is going to keep happening. And there are ways, if we can figure out how to talk with each other and share and manage this dynamic better, that we can help each other in this. And we have to because it is one big combined system. So, with that, I think, what are some other findings that we had? Alex?
Yeah, we found that bringing third-party expertise to bear on incidents is challenging. So one of the value adds that people usually propose when they think about handing over operational responsibilities from a team internally to a third party is, that's their core competency, they have the expertise, and when we need them during an incident, they can just come in on a white steed with their expertise and just solve the problem. Well, that's actually really challenging. And even getting a hold of the expertise is difficult because it's locked away between concentric layers of different tiers of support, and it can take a substantial amount of time to even get access to that expertise. And that expertise, when it does come into the incident, often has almost no context into what was looked at, how their technology is situated in the system, and what people have already done. So this is not a new finding. This is a dynamic that's called out in the Stella report. This is a report put out in 2017 by the Snafu Catchers Consortium, and I want to share an excerpt from that I think really highlights this. For work where immediate anomaly response is essential, it can be impossible for the expert to gain enough context so that her expertise can be fully employed. I'm just going to sit with that because I think it's really important. There's another dynamic that can take place that can make bringing third-party expertise really challenging, and that's a friction that can occur between the organization and a vendor. And this can happen across multiple incidents. Maybe you're having a lot of incidents with that vendor and you're growing frustrated. Maybe there's some erosion of goodwill that has happened for whatever reason with the vendor. And sometimes it's spontaneous friction that can occur during an incident. One example of this is an incident that we had where it was a message bus vendor, and this was a few years ago. We had an incident occur over multiple hours, and we finally got through to support on this message bus vendor. And when we finally got them on the call, we were so relieved because we knew that they would know what was going on. And they asked for trace logging. They asked us to turn the logging level up to trace. And we're like, oh man, they might be kind of incompetent. We didn't realize. And then when they saw how we were configuring their product, they were like, they kind of don't know what they're doing with our product. They're incompetent. But that's an opportunity to stop and recognize when friction might be in the system and say, all right, it's probably unlikely that these two parties are incompetent. Maybe we can stop and appreciate that maybe what they're asking for makes sense to them given their context. How did it make sense is a question we can ask when our first instinct is to call it incompetence. So that's one way to effectively manage friction in these socio-technical systems. So we kind of covered a lot of the challenges that we uncovered with the multi-party dilemma. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for recap.
Yeah, and I will say I love the point that Alex mentioned, because one of the first really tangible things when we were studying this that a colleague of mine shared was stop asking why someone did something, because it's kind of an accusatory question, and start asking how it made sense to them at the time. And I realized, like, it was a very subtle shift. As soon as I did that, I was so much less frustrated and so much more understanding of what was happening on the other side of the boundary. So if you're looking for like a super concrete takeaway, I would say that's a really good one to start with. So I love that Alex covered that. The friction and frustration is some of the newer research that we have, so we're very excited to start getting into that. But for now, let's recap. We have been going for about 30 minutes. We have thrown a lot of things at you. So if you are the I want to take a picture type, give me a quick recap in 2 slides type, here we go. Not necessarily gonna read it all, but we'll do a bit. No, I'm gonna do it from over here because if I look up that way, I get dizzy and that's not gonna work. So yeah, it turns out if you read it from the direction you're expecting to read it, it works a lot better. The multi-party dilemma. It's a pattern that describes challenges at organizational boundaries between interdependent parties. It has characteristics. Asymmetry is gonna be a key characteristic of it, higher cost of coordination, and then potential goal misalignment or mission misalignment. It is most prevalent or maybe most evident in temporally compact pressurized environments, and it's new forms of failure, new forms of work, and new forms of brittleness in complex systems. Some of the challenges and key findings here. So there's legal, financial, and privacy concerns that we're still working to figure out how we can address, and I would say we'll probably never have like a prescriptive way that everybody can do them, but we're just encouraging people to start thinking about this. Recognizing that there are hidden dependencies in your system, looking and considering the cost of coordination and how you can lower the cost of coordination, considering mission misalignment, maybe in some cases with vendors or with teams, having discussions in advance to understand what that mission misalignment might look like and how you might resolve it. sharing information, and if possible, getting into bidirectional information sharing at an engineering level where it's very deep and you actually can figure out what you can do with that information is very helpful. There are challenges to bringing expertise to bear. Expertise is great, but it does require context. And if you think about in advance how to help bring the context when you pull in people with expertise, that can be very helpful in making this less frustrating. And being aware of the friction in the system, which is something that, like, these are very human response. Incidents are very human things. And being aware of the friction, I think, is very helpful in managing that. We joke that, like, if you wanted to really simplify this talk down, we would just say, like, the talk is about why it's hard to have incidents with different teams and different vendors. And so friction is certainly a factor there. With that being said, Alex, where do we go from here?
Well, the short answer is there are no answers. And I know that's unsatisfying to hear. But there are things that we're starting to think about, things we're starting to try. And I want to kind of get into a little bit of how we're thinking about it. So traceability of incident data is a consideration. That can help you understand how effectively you're handling the multi-party dilemma. Capturing that incident data for looking at later with the vendor can be really helpful. It's important to pick, you can't do this maybe for all of your vendors, especially if you have a lot of them, but pick some key vendors to start forming partnerships with in advance of having incidents. So can you share the way you're working, operational models, expertise, your mental models? This can really help with incident response. And you might be able to involve them in things like game days or through Slack Connect. Have discussions before and after the incident with those other parties. Do perspective taking. Try to understand their challenges and the goals that they're trying to establish. Maybe you can kind of define a joint framework together. And then maybe you can have periodic office hours or meeting times throughout the year with them. These are also ways to kind of reduce that friction that we were talking about. And then identify existing informal networks of expertise and cultivate new ones. And what I mean by an informal network of expertise, it could include all the people in your company that have worked for the vendor in the past or are really well connected with people in that company, because you might be able to tap that in kind of a bottom-up way to involve the vendor more quickly or get past those challenging concentric rings of support that you have to get through to get to the engineers, to get to the expertise. So I really want to challenge everybody on trying out things in addressing this that you might think are out of reach or impossible, given the legal, privacy, and security issues we described. Can you ask the vendor if they can share their screen and walk you through what they're looking at during an incident? I know that might seem out of reach, but just ask them. What's the worst that they could say is no. Can one of their experts attend a design review within your organization? Can you shadow one of their support engineers for a day, even if that involves some of their customers? Can we invite members of their staff to our retrospectives, design review, or sprint planning? What if we reveal to the vendor the versions of their product that we're running in production, how it's situated in our architecture by showing them diagrams, or even showing them kind of our sprint planning backlog? And how do contracts need to change? Even though the ink is dry, it doesn't mean that you can't revisit them with the vendor, or maybe it's up for renewals soon. You can kind of do things, revisit lines in that contract that are posing challenges to having incidents with the vendor. Sarah, what's next with this?
Yeah, so I think for us, what's next with this is actually more research. This is one of those topics that I was talking with Alex about it, I think even last night. And I was saying, like, well, it's really intuitive, but yet we keep finding so much research on it. And he reminded me that intuitive things are not always right, and so that's part of why we do this research. So we're very excited. We have the opportunity to partner with a research lab in the US that is looking at this multi-party dilemma across all sorts of industries. At a lot of depth, they've got a lot of expertise that they can bring in different fields. We want to be able to represent tech well. And to do that, we need to have your experiences and your stories. We certainly have our own. We have some from our networks of people that we talk to, but we'd love to be able to offer a broader audience to take part in this. So if this sounds interesting to you, if you're sitting there going, I have a story I'd love to share, if you're sitting there going, I want to vent and rant and rave about how difficult this is. If you're saying, I've tried this and I have a great idea, I want to see if other people work out with that. If you're sitting there and going, I have an idea that worked terribly, y'all should know and don't try it. Any of that is of interest to us. And so we've got a QR code here. If you go there, it's a form, and it basically, you just give us your information, and as we start doing some of this next round of research, we'll be able to reach out and start connecting with you with that. Other ways to do it, come find us at the conference. We're more than happy to chat about this. Reach out to us on Slack. But yeah, we would absolutely love for y'all to be part of this. We would love to be able to represent tech well as one of the industries in this multi-industry consortium that's going to talk through how we can address this dynamic better. Finally, we wanted to give some acknowledgement. So Alex and I get to stand up on stage and present this, but all of the analysis work is not done by us. It is done by us and a large group of people and teams. There's also wonderful groups of academics who have really helped us bring concepts from academia or concepts that they're studying into this and connect the dots between the practical and the theoretical. So we owe tremendous gratitude to everybody on this slide and others as well, probably. Finally, I know that people like references, so if you're interested in any of the references where we talked about, or if you're saying, oh, I want to go look at this, I want to read the Stellar report, I've never heard of that, these are all our references. We're happy to share more as well. And with that, thank you very much. It's an honor to get to present.
Thanks.